He was the only South Carolinian in his class at Berkeley. And so I'll start there. And he started in a small bureau at the St. Petersburg Times, which is in Florida, not Russia. And then went to LA Times and has been honored with a ton of different awards, and is now here as a Knight Fellow. And what exactly is the project you're working on?
So the Knight Fellowships are a one-year fellowship here at Stanford that brings 20 journalists from around the world to work on journalism projects to advance the future of journalism, because journalism is a lot of projects right now. My particular project has to do, I work for a company called ProPublica, which is a nonprofit startup based in New York. We do long-form investigative journalism, stories that take like a year or 6 months to do. And then we partner with major media outlets like the New York Times or 60 Minutes to air those stories. My particular project is focused on creating an international version of ProPublica. So tracking the effects of U.S. policy, U.S. Corporate activity, U.S. Contractors in developing countries, and how can you do cross-border investigative reporting, which is very difficult and costly and expensive and doesn't really have a way to support itself now.
Great. So we'll do about half lecture and half discussion. I'll pass around the attendance sheet for those of you who are enrolled for credit about halfway through.
Okay, good. All right, so like Eric said, I'm going to talk today about media and the mental health. I'm going to do it through my specific lens. And I hope that today is really like a practicum in ethics, because I'm coming here very much as a seeker, searching for input and feedback. Because these are not, although I have developed a set of kind of my own set of solutions to this issue, I'm not at all sure they're correct, and in fact they might be completely wrong. And so I really encourage you, and by the time I'm done, to be thinking about putting yourself in my shoes and what you would have done, and whether or not I did the right thing or the wrong thing, because I'm not very sure of that. And I really would value that feedback as somebody who works in this area and can continue to work in this area. So as Eric said, I work for ProPublica, and we do long-form investigative journalism. And I have spent most of the past 10 years covering, I do international investigative journalism, and since most of the international policy focus of the U.S. has been in Iraq and Afghanistan the last 10 years, I've basically spent the last 10 years covering some aspect of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. The most recent past 4 or 5 years, I've spent specifically looking at the after effects of the war, what they call the home front. When people come back from the battlefield, what happens to them? And that naturally leads pretty quickly into questions about mental illness, specifically post-traumatic stress disorder and traumatic brain injury. By some estimates, 1 out of every 4 men and women who were served in Iraq and Afghanistan suffered either traumatic brain injury, post-traumatic stress disorder, or another pretty serious mental condition like depression, maybe depression. And they're now there's been 2 million people total who have served at one point in time in those 2 theaters. Many of them were from sort of rural, distant parts of America that don't have easy access to mental health care. And so they're an underserved and overlooked population of people. And thus, for me, constituted an interesting topic to look into. So what I want to do today is sort of look at 3 case studies that really bugged me. They bugged me then when I was doing the stories, and they bug me today because I'm not sure that I did them right or I did them well even. And I'll just kind of take you through kind of the issues in each of those stories, and then I'm going to talk about kind of the solutions that I and my partner in these stories sort of developed to try and deal with some of these issues about covering people with mental health issues. So the fundamental question here is, how do you balance the public interest in returning a bunch of veterans who have mental health problems, which are in our schools, in our churches, in our universities, everywhere, in our society? How do you balance the public interest, and our interest in knowing about these people, what they're going through, and what can be done about them, with those individuals' personal rights to dignity and privacy? And can you do that in a humane and ethical way? That's the fundamental problem. How do you cover that issue? So I'll give you 3 case studies to kind of illustrate that point. And they each illustrate a slightly different aspect of it. the first series I kind of worked on had to do with private contractors. And private contractors in Iraq, as you may know, aren't exactly the most popular people. They have a very negative stigma associated with them as being sort of these war profiteers, gun-toting guys. But these wars in Iraq and Afghanistan were the most privatized in history. You had one private contractor for every single American soldier on the battlefield, which means you essentially created an entire, what I call a new class of pseudo-veteran. These are civilians who have had the experience of war, but don't have any of the military support structure or psychological support structure that the military puts in place for its soldiers. Most of the contractors were not the gun-toting mercenaries, Blackwater type guys you saw. The vast bulk of them were from rural parts of Middle America who were attracted by both patriotism but also the huge paycheck because of unemployment, because they couldn't buy a house, they couldn't pay for their kids' braces, they couldn't pay for a college education. And so they could go over to Iraq and Afghanistan and make a lot of money really quickly. And there's no two ways about that, that's what they were doing. But they were often injured grievously. Legs thrown apart, they saw people cut in half. They suffered mortar shellings. If you were on a base, you were being mortared, and a soldier, a bullet does not make a difference between a soldier and a civilian at all. Same thing happens. So these people returned back home without any kind of military, without any kind of support. They were going back home with general practitioners and to family therapy counselors to deal with really dark, deep problems. And that's the initial story I started out to tell is, do you just ignore these people because they took a risk and they made a lot of money, and does mercy have a price? Do we ignore, everybody cares a lot about veterans and their mental health, but then do we ignore this entire enormous class of 1 million people or so who made a lot of money, it's true, but also are now suffering very dearly as a result of these choices. The first story I did was on a guy named Reggie Lane, the in-depth story I did. And I should explain that ProPublica does long-form stories. So these, I'll spend often months with a particular subject or topic developing it. And Reggie Lane was a truck driver who was injured in a fuel convoy and was left in a semi-vegetative state. Grenade passed through part of his brain and a fragment of shell, a splinter of a grenade, and he was left in a kind of vegetative state. Had to have 24-hour full nursing home care. He was in the middle of Oregon, in sort of central Oregon, at a rest home that had no facilities for physical therapy or speech therapy or anything else. And when I entered the picture, the debate was very much live as to whether or not Reggie Lane had any kind of cognitive function left or not. On the one side was his family, who believed that he deserved the insurance companies, which cover these guys, should pay for speech therapy because he did have some inkling left. He could communicate through his eyes, or he could gesture. And on the other side was the insurance companies, doctors who were saying that no, he was basically brain dead, and there was nothing left of him. So I decided to do a story on this debate, and I had to interview Reggie Lane at some length. I interviewed his family. His family members were very welcome. There's no legal issue here. He had power of attorney was given to his wife. But we were telling very intimate details about Reggie Lane, about the troubles he had in high school, about his bankruptcies, his financial histories, some of his drug abuse problems when he was a teenager, all the way through to what he had done in Iraq, to his life now where he had to be bathed. We were taking pictures of him being bathed and fed, writing about that. And so it was my job to sort of to talk to him and interview him, and I cannot tell you to this day with any certainty whether or not Reggie Lane was a willing participant in that story. I had no way of knowing. Over time, I believe I developed enough of a belief that he could communicate with his eyes. I would talk to him, I would explain to him everything that I was doing. I'm writing a story about you, I think it will help other people. But if he was conscious enough to know that, I would, he would blink and say yes, and I would try and convince myself that yes, that was an acquiescence to this. But I'm not a neurologist, I'm not a speech therapist, I don't have any of that kind of expertise. So I don't know to this day whether or not the story I did about Reggie Lane ended up violating his own sense of personhood, his own sense of humanity, whether or not he wanted his story told, whether or not he wanted to let his wife's story be told or not. And so So that's case number one. Is how do you deal with an individual who scientifically you don't really know whether or not has the ability to consent to participate in an interview with a mass media audience, which is going to broadcast these very intimate details to a wider audience. The second case study I want to talk to you about is the guys who have traumatic brain injuries. And the interesting thing about people with mild to moderate traumatic brain injuries is they actually appear cognitively quite functional. And one of the series story was about how the military was failing to diagnose hundreds of thousands of soldiers who had really significant executive function problems, but they were very difficult to detect. It took a long time, a very experienced therapist or neurologist to kind of figure out what these guys' deficits were. Because in a quick 10-minute conversation, somebody that's had a concussion or a mild traumatic brain injury can seem quite lucid and will remember what's going on and can have quite a detailed conversation with you. But over time, as I'm spending most of these guys, you do see that they don't actually, they can't remember things. They can't they can't read very well anymore. They can't drive from their home to the grocery store and back and remember the same way they came. They forget their wives' names. They forget their children's names. They anger quickly. These are all very symptomatic. They take a long time to show up and to realize. So at some point in time where I interviewed 20 or 30 of these guys, I realized, well, once again, is it possible to get free, full consent with somebody who actually is lacking a significant portion of his executive function? I explain exactly what I'm doing. I'm doing a story about traumatic brain injury. It will be broadcast. It will be aired to tens of thousands or millions of people. And they would be very, yes, I want my story told. I've been ignored by the military. I want help. But can a person who literally can't follow the instructions on a box of microwave food actually understand the implications that his image is going to be broadcast, that his future employers will see him, people who don't understand the idea of concussion, that he looks quite normal and he's faking this just to get benefits. All those things could happen. I would explain them, and he would appear to understand them, but ultimately, did he really? And that was the question I began to face after doing a lot of these stories. And I'll never forget that. I mean, a lot of the interviews would sort of turn into almost therapy sessions where I remember talking to a husband and a wife, and them chattering away, and the wife was sort of just, they had obviously never talked about the problems he had had. He was undiagnosed, not been treated. And they had obviously themselves never talked about these problems, and she was going on about how he had screamed at their children one day, and she said, you know, I married this guy, and he was this fun-filled, happy, wonderful guy. And you could see as the interview was going on that she was realizing her husband was right next to her, and going to say, but now he's like this. And the husband, I've never seen such a stone-faced look in my life as he sort of listened to his wife basically tell him that she was no longer married to the man that she had originally married. And that moment happening right there in that interview and realizing that all of a sudden I needed to be a marriage therapist without any kind of training or ability to be a marriage therapist was a painful moment for me as a journalist. But it was really illustrative of the problem. So it's a second set of issues of people who have brain injury and they have damage to certain functions of their brain although they will appear to consent and are legally completely under the law able to sign contracts and mortgages and everything else. Ethically speaking, can a journalist use that person in a story in a way that he or she might not, there's no way they can conceive of the long-term effects of that story. The final case study I want to talk about is, and this is the one that disturbs me the most, are people who have post-traumatic stress disorder. And for those of you who don't know, post-traumatic stress disorder is a mental disorder which is usually caused by an experience of a terrifying event in a war. It's a stereotype disease you see from veterans who are having psychotic breakdowns and episodes like that. It's been much over-dramatized, but it's a real thing. And although I didn't focus specifically on post-traumatic stress disorder, many people who have traumatic brain injuries also have post-traumatic stress disorder because that brain injury, an explosion that threw their head against the side of a Humvee or knocked them to the ground, occurred in the middle of battle. And there's some research that shows that if you have a traumatic brain injury, you're actually more vulnerable to the kind of chemical damage that a post-traumatic, the terror of that's caused with the hormones that are going through your head, chemicals that are rushing through your head. It's kind of what they think causes or damages some of the brain circuitry in post-traumatic stress disorder. And so the TBI makes you more vulnerable to post-traumatic stress disorder. So you have this horrible twinning of guys who both have actual physical brain damage because of a brain injury, and then they have mental damage because of a psychological disorder. So one of the characteristics of post-traumatic stress disorder, though, is they resist going back to the incident which caused them the terror in the first place. And in fact, one of the primary treatments for post-traumatic disorder is a very gradual re-immersion into that setting, that scenario, to get them anesthetized to the kind of pain that causes them, the trauma that causes them. But I'm a journalist. My job is, on those basic journalistic levels, to get the facts straight. So I need to interview these guys, and I need to take them through that moment, both before and afterwards, so I can then fact check what happened to these people, so I know that they're not actually telling the truth, and I'm telling a truthful story. But moreover, I'm trying to create a bond, an emotional bond between the reader and the subject, so that you can identify with these people, understand exactly what they went through. So it's necessary to go through extraordinary details that are absurdly comic to outsiders, like, what color was the blood that was going down his outfit, so that I can write a story that really kind of attaches to you. Or you said that he was cut in half by the 50 cal gun that shot through him. Well, what half was left at the bottom? These really sort of details that I think even a therapist wouldn't require the level of detail that I need to cinematographically tell you what occurred. So I would leave some of these PTSD sessions talking with guys who have PTSD, undiagnosed, diagnosed, convinced that I'd caused more damage than good. That I had left an individual who might, at the very least, self-medicate with painkillers or alcohol, which is a very common response to PTSD people, to at the very worst, consider committing suicide. And there were moments when I would call the next morning to make sure they were there and they were okay. And those are some of the most painful interviews I've ever done. To just watch these guys try and grapple with these moments, and it would take months sometimes even just to even talk about them. So those are the three kind of, you got people who are minimally cognitively functional, people who appear cognitively functional but have serious damages, and then people who have this post-traumatic stress disorder, which the reliving of it actually can trigger a psychotic episode. So I did these sort of a period of 4 or 5 years of worth of interviews with my colleague Daniel Zwerdling, who is a reporter at NPR, and who luckily comes from a family of therapists. He's not himself a therapist, but comes from a family of therapists. And so we developed kind of a checklist that we would do before we go in every interview. So this is where we get to what my own solution is, but it's not what I think is the best solution necessarily, or maybe there's no solution. So the first thing we do is we would always want a family member involved. That wasn't always possible because some soldiers were alone, and those were often the most striking cases. The guys trying to deal with them by themselves, a 19-year-old or 20-year-old kid who's dropped a 500-pound bomb on 40 or 50 people and destroyed a village. That's a heavy thing to deal with when you're 19 years old, 18 years old. But we always try to have a family member who is both present with us and who is willing to cooperate. We would never do a story where there were some cases where a veteran, he or she would want to talk to us, but the family members would not, and that was no-go. Because our basic thinking there was that if the family members are not involved in the story, then the guy literally has no support system at all. Zero. And if he does have problems, then he's got nobody to turn to, and his family would just sort of like say, "Oh, you were the idiot who agreed to the interview. Why did you do that?" So I always wanted to have family involved. The second thing is we would do multiple interviews. So it wasn't like, so I'm talking from my particular lens of journalism. You should know that most journalists don't have months to take to very slowly go through multiple interviews with the subject. If most journalists, they walk in and there's been a story about mental health and, I don't know, a battalion's coming back and you're in Colorado at Fort Collins and you do a story that day about post-traumatic stress disorder, you have an hour with a soldier. And so trying to get that guy to tell you about his horrible experiences in an hour. Our practice goes through multiple interviews over time, back away when it became obvious there was being disturbing, go back again, if we had to do later. And the feeling there was that was almost a therapeutic approach, kind of going very slowly. A third approach was to kind of break down some of the objective walls that exist typically between the subject and an interview. And that means like literally hugging people or comforting them. Sort of trying to put them in contact sometimes with local resources if they have local resources. From a strictly journalistic point of view, you're crossing a line. You've crossed a line from being an objective field observer like an anthropologist would be to becoming not an advocate necessarily, but to doing more than, you have interfered upon a situation at that stage of the game. You're becoming an actor rather than an observer of the scene. So journalistically, that's certainly bending, if not breaking, the journalistic rules. And then our ultimate safeguard was that we, and again, was definitely journalistically strange, was that we did everything off the record. And that means many things in many different contexts. So quick tip, if you're interviewed by a journalist and he says they're off the record, make sure you understand, both understand what that means. In some contexts, that means I can quote you in a story or feature you in a news story, but not have your name. In other contexts, it means that, well, in the most formal context, it means that how we define it is, nothing you say or do here today will appear in print, on broadcast, on radio, in any form, unless you give me your explicit permission. And I will read back to you that portion of the story which is about you to make sure that I get your story right. And that was important. Now, that's taking a big risk. I mean, if you spend 5 months with some guy, and then he decides in the end, I just don't want to, or some family members I just don't want to, your boss is going to want to know what you're doing for 5 months, and you will have lost that whole story. But we thought you just had to give them a sense of control. You have control. This is your story, and you have control over it. And I think it's important. It has a public aspect and interest to it. But I want you to have a final sense of control over it. And a lot of people with PTSD and brain injury both have a sense of loss of control. And that was our way of kind of trying to reinsert this in a kind of artificial way, a sense that they still own their own experience. They own their own personhood. So we try to get the family involved. Make sure there's a support network. We try to do these multiple interviews, so we go slowly. We did try to express sympathy and support, and then finally we did make sure that it was all off the record. So those were our safeguards. What were the results? I can tell you that in 5 years of reporting and several hundred people interviewed, I only had one complaint from a family that their story was misrepresented. That's the other thing about the multiple interviews. I want to just jump back for a second. One, we wanted them to have control over their story, but also we wanted them to know that we wanted to get their story right. That we were really interested in being accurate and fair and true to their experience, rather than kind of really quickly ripping something out of them that might or might not be agree with what they were, didn't agree with what they experienced, which happens often in journalism. The person in the interview often believes that his experience is not accurately reflected in the interview. We want to make sure they had control and they had a feeling of truth to these stories because they wanted the truth out. So I can't tell you. So I had one family member react badly. Now that doesn't mean it was right, ethically right, because of those hundreds of people, maybe 3 dozen actually appeared in our stories. I don't know I haven't tracked them all. I don't know how they are today. I don't know what happened to them later. I know some got help. The military jumped in and tried to help them. I know that some people, it was a very painful experience, but they ultimately found comfort in the idea that they were helping those who come behind, which is a phrase in the military, help those who come behind me. But I'm not part of closed-door conversations. I don't know what's said behind between family members. I don't know if there's been divorces or breakups or suicides even, or in the worst-case scenario. So I come today really with those are our solutions, but not really knowing if they were the best ones at all. What I do know is that you can't ignore them. That's what I'm certain of. Is that these are important and vital stories for the public interest, and you can't, as a country, send 2 million people over to a war zone and then have them come back and believe that there's not a public interest in knowing what effects those people are what those people are experiencing. And so that we have to tell those stories. They have to be told. And the question that I have is how, given my own comfort zone and discomfort with this, is how do you balance illuminating an issue like with these soldiers, mental health soldiers, while simultaneously protecting an individual's right to their own story, their own dignity, and their own sense of themselves. So.